The day I realized I had never been loved. I was standing in the cereal aisle of a grocery store on a Tuesday morning, watching a mother brush the hair out of her daughter's eyes. That's all she did. Just brushed it away with 2 fingers and tucked it behind the little girl's ear. And I had to leave the aisle because I couldn't breathe. I was 34 years old, and I had never, not once, felt what that little girl felt in that moment. I want you to stay with me, because this story doesn't end in that grocery store. It doesn't end in grief either. And I grew up in a house full of people who didn't know how to love me. Not because they were evil, not because they were monsters. You can make sense of a monster. You can name it, label it, keep your distance. What's harder, so much harder, is growing up in a home that looks completely normal from the street, where your mother is respected at work and your father coaches Little League, and still somehow never once feeling like you belong there. Never once feeling like you were wanted. Not really. Not in the way that counts. This is the story of what that does to a person. What it did to me. And more than that, so much more, this is the story of how I finally found my way out. Not by waiting for someone to rescue me. Not by being rescued at all, really. But by discovering something that changed the direction of my entire life. But to understand where I arrived, you have to travel the whole road with me. You have to see every turn. Every place I chose wrong, and every place I chose right, and every place I stood frozen in the middle of a choice, unable to move. Because this story only means something if you've walked the length of it. So, here we go. Back to the beginning. Back to the house that looked fine from the outside. I was born second. My brother Thomas came first. And from the moment I was old enough to understand the way attention works in a family, the way it pulls in certain places and leaves others dry, I understood that Thomas had claimed most of it before I ever arrived. He was athletic, bright, charming in the way boys are when adults find them delightful. He filled rooms without effort. And I was quieter, watchful, the kind of child who sits in corners at parties and listens, who notices things no one thinks she's noticing. The kind of child who, if you weren't paying attention, could disappear from a room without anyone registering the change. My mother's name was Diane. She was a practical woman, the kind who kept the house immaculate and showed love through action rather than words, or so she always explained. Later, when I was old enough to ask, she cooked good meals. She washed our clothes without complaint. She attended our school plays and sat in the front row. But she never told me she loved me in a way I could feel. Not in the texture of it. There was a distance in her that I couldn't name as a child. Only sense, the way you sense a draft through a wall you can't find a crack in. You know it's there. You feel the cold. But you can't put your hand on the source. My father, Gerald, was warmer on the surface. He laughed easily, had a booming voice, told the same stories at dinner parties over and over until even the guests knew the punchlines. But he had a particular blindness when it came to me. I know that sounds impossible. But if you've experienced it, you know exactly what I mean. He would look toward me and his eyes would slide, just slightly, to Thomas standing next to me, and his face would shift into something lit and alive, and I would feel myself becoming just for a moment transparent. It's not invisible exactly. More like glass, something you see through rather than at. We had just come back from my brother's baseball game. He had pitched beautifully, and our parents were glowing with it, still talking about that final inning as they moved through the kitchen. I had a drawing in my backpack that my teacher had held up in class that day. She had said it was exceptional. She had used that word, and I had sat at my desk and felt something that I can only describe as radiant. This warm, full, lit-up feeling of being recognized for something true. I had carried that drawing home like a treasure. I had thought about the moment all the way on the bus. I had imagined setting it on the kitchen table and hearing my parents say something, anything, that mirrored how my teacher had looked at me. I set it on the table. I waited. My father picked it up, looked at it for maybe 3 seconds, said, "That's nice, hun," in the same tone he used when he said "looks like rain," just words filling air. Words that meant nothing, words that were the shape of attention without any of its substance, and set it back down. My mother glanced at it over her shoulder from the stove and smiled briefly and went back to stirring. That was it. That was the whole moment. I took the drawing upstairs. I put it in my desk drawer. Deep down in the part of themselves that will take decades to excavate, I decided that wanting things like that was dangerous. It leaves you feeling like the wanting itself is a flaw. Like the very fact that you wanted proves you were asking for something you hadn't earned. That is the wound, not the parents who didn't see. The belief the child builds around the not being seen. And here is where I need to ask you something, because you might be listening to this and thinking, that doesn't sound so bad. That sounds like ordinary disappointment, ordinary childhood. And you might be right, objectively, that nothing dramatic happened in that kitchen. But I want to ask you, when was the last time you truly felt seen? Because if you can remember that feeling, you understand what it means to grow up without it. And if you can't remember that feeling, if you're thinking right now, has that ever actually happened? Then maybe you already understand more than you think. I spent most of elementary school making myself useful. If I couldn't be loved for who I was, I could be needed for what I could do. I helped teachers sort papers. I organized classroom shelves. I became the reliable one, the responsible one, the low-maintenance one. I built a life inside my head that was richer than the one outside it. Books became where I lived. I read everything I could find, not just for the stories, but for the sense they gave me of other people's insides. Proof that the world was full of complex feeling, even if my own house had been drained of it. The only place I ever completely felt at home. My bedroom was my country. My desk was my capital. I never opened without feeling the particular weight of what was in it. Suddenly, the architecture of social connection became complicated in ways I had no map for. Of sharing, of belonging that they'd been given, along with their childhood, and I'd somehow missed. She had a laugh that could fill a hallway, and she was curious about everything and everyone, the way some people are curious as a fundamental orientation toward the world. Not performance, not strategy, just genuine interest. And for some reason that I still can't fully explain, she was curious about me. She sat next to me at lunch one Wednesday in October of 7th grade and asked me what I was reading. And I told her, and instead of nodding and looking away like most people did, she leaned in. She actually leaned in and said, "Tell me more." I don't think she had any idea. She saved me a seat. She included me in her plans, the way you include a person when you've simply decided they're supposed to be there, not as an afterthought. But wanting something and knowing how to accept it are two entirely different skills. When love shows up, even small love, friendly love, the love of inclusion, it doesn't feel safe when you've grown up without a model for receiving it. So, instead of accepting it, you hold it at arm's length. You give just enough to maintain the connection, but never enough to let it fully in. That's what I did to Priya. I gave her the version of me that was useful and interesting and low to men. But I never gave her the version that was actually there, and she tried. She was offering me the thing I needed most, and I was slowly, without knowing it, building a wall right down the middle of our friendship. I watched her from across the cafeteria that first week of 9th grade. It was grief. I just didn't have a word for it yet. Childhood loneliness is a dull ache, constant, like something you've grown around the way a tree grows around a fence. Not broken in a dramatic way, just broken in a quiet way, the way a clock runs a little slow. You don't notice it at first. But over time, the gap between where you are and where you should be becomes impossible to ignore. There was a boy named Marcus in my junior year English class. He was thoughtful, the kind of quiet that comes from having things to say rather than nothing to say. We were assigned to the same literary analysis group, and over 4 weeks of afternoon meetings in the school library, we developed something that I now understand was the beginning of what could have been love. He would look at me when I talked. He remembered things I'd said from weeks before. He laughed at things I hadn't intended to be funny, which is the most intimate kind of laughter, because it means someone is paying close enough attention to find the hidden jokes in your sentences. And then he waited, the way someone waits when they've said something true and they're hoping you'll meet them there. I told him he was being dramatic. I laughed it off. I said something self-deprecating and light, closed my locker, said I'd see him tomorrow, and walked away. And I spent the entire walk home in a conversation with myself that was so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Why did I do that? Why did I always do that? He had handed me exactly what I had always wanted: to be seen, to be found interesting, to have my presence matter to someone in that particular way, and I had handed it back like it was something I didn't need. I went home and sat on my bedroom floor and cried for the first time in years. Not soft, quiet crying. The kind that surprises you with how physical it is, how long it goes on, how your body seems to have been holding it longer than you knew. Marcus got a girlfriend 2 weeks later. A girl named Serena who was open and warm and let him see her, which is all he had ever been asking me to do. I didn't blame him. I had made myself unavailable in every way that mattered. I had done it so efficiently that he probably didn't even know he'd been rejected. He just knew I wasn't available and found someone who was. That the problem was not circumstance or timing, but something essential in me. This is the belief that would run my life for the next 15 years. I want to pause here because I need you to understand something before we go further. You don't even know they're there most of the time. You just think you're making rational choices, practical choices. You live that way and call it preferences. I moved across the country for college, which felt like freedom but was actually just relocation. You can change the geography completely, and the first morning you wake up in the new place. Literature is the art of observing lives from a safe remove. It gives you proximity to human experience without requiring you to participate in it. I was exceptionally good at it. There was a professor in my second year, Dr. Ann Ellison, who taught contemporary fiction and had the kind of mind that made you feel like every conversation was happening in a slightly more interesting universe than the one you'd been in before. She liked my writing. She told me so directly, without qualification, the way people who are very sure of themselves deliver compliments, not as kindness, but as simple, accurate observation. You see something and you name it. She named what she saw in me. She called it a voice. She said I had the rarest thing, which was perspective, a way of seeing that was entirely my own, that couldn't be learned or borrowed. She suggested I apply to a summer literary program. She said she thought I had real potential. And something in me reacted the way it always had, with equal parts hunger and terror, leaning forward and pulling back at the same time. I didn't apply. And I smiled and thanked her and graduated into a world I had absolutely no framework for inhabiting. It was control. The placement of objects, the cleanliness of surfaces, the predictability of a routine held to like a life raft. Nights when I would stand at my window looking at the city below, all those lit windows, all those people in their rooms leading their unwitnessed lives, and feel a loneliness so specific it had a texture. Like cold glass under your palm, like the sound of someone else's music from an apartment above you, just muffled enough that you can't make out the song. You know there is something there. You just can't quite reach it. At 26, I had my first real relationship. His name was Daniel, and he was a graphic designer with long, careful hands and a gentleness that I initially mistook for weakness because I had confused gentleness with fragility my whole life. He wasn't fragile at all. He was one of the most grounded people I've ever known. He just wore that groundedness quietly. He pursued me in a way that was patient and consistent. Not urgent, not dramatic, just present. He kept showing up. And then he didn't try to fix the silence or fill it with performance. He just stood there next to me, looking at the city, and I felt for the first time I can name precisely that I did not need to be someone else in his company, because surely no one was just kind without a motive. He stayed exactly himself. And that stability, that consistency, frightened me more than cruelty would have. His steadiness had no place to live in my existing story. I became slightly less available, slightly more careful. I would cancel plans when I felt too close to him, too exposed, and retreat for a few days and come back slightly more defended than before. Adding another layer, another inch of distance. And I used his goodness against him without meaning to. It ended on a Sunday afternoon in his kitchen. He was making pasta. And out of nowhere, without planning to, he stopped stirring and turned around and said, "Caroline, do you want this? Do you actually want to be here?" He wasn't angry. He looked tired. Not from lack of sleep, but from the particular exhaustion of someone who has been kind for a long time to someone who won't let them close. He said, "I feel like I'm always meeting you halfway and you're always standing in the middle and I don't know how to get to where you are." I didn't have an answer for him. I sat very still and felt the truth of what he was saying move through me like cold water, and I had no language for it. No way to say, "I know you're right and I want to want this. And I don't know how to want it without being terrified." And I didn't know how to be terrified with someone else in the room. Because being terrified in front of someone is the most naked thing there is. And I had never been naked in front of anyone. So I said I was sorry. I said I thought maybe I wasn't in the right place for a relationship. What I felt instead was something harder and darker than tears. The complete, flat certainty that this was my pattern, and my pattern was my limit, and my limit was my life. It's what I didn't know. What I had absolutely no way of knowing, standing on that sidewalk in the October cold, was that in 2 years, I would receive a phone call that would dismantle every story I had ever built about myself. That the worst, which felt so present and so permanent, was not actually the point of the story. I was 32 when my mother called me from a hospital. I need you to sit with that sentence for a moment. She called me from a hospital, and her voice was a voice I had never heard from her before. Not the practical, even-keeled voice she used on our Sunday phone calls. This was a voice without its armor. I heard it in the first syllable of my name. She said Caroline, and in the single word I heard what I had never heard from her. She needed me. My father had a stroke. Severe, he was 59 years old, and he had been at his desk on a Wednesday morning when the right side of his world simply shut off. I booked a flight before the call was finished. The flight matters. Something more complicated and ugly. Something I was ashamed of for a long time before I could admit it. Relief, not relief that my father had a stroke. Not that, but relief that something had happened big enough to justify going home without having to explain why I was going. I had not been home in 14 months. It meaning something I'm not ready to examine. I need you to hold that with me. The shame of that relief. Because it tells you everything about how complicated it is to grow up in a house that doesn't quite see you. Because at the bottom of all the distance, you still wanted to belong there. The wanting never left. It just went underground, like all the other wanting. My mother met me at the hospital. She had been there for 11 hours. She looked small in a way I had never seen before. My mother had always seemed immovably solid, a woman whose posture refused to give ground. And now she was sitting in the waiting room in the same clothes she'd put on that morning, her hands in her lap doing nothing at all. Which was the most alarming thing about her. She never did nothing with her hands. I sat next to her, 2 feet apart in the plastic chairs. I wanted to do the right thing. To reach for her hand, to say something that would close the distance between us. But I had never learned how to do that. So I sat next to her and said, "I'm here." And she said, "Yes." And we looked at the wall together, and I thought, this is us. 3 weeks in the hospital, 2 months in rehabilitation, relearning the things the stroke had taken the right side of his body, some words through reliable access to his own history. He would say a name and mean another. He would begin a sentence and lose it halfway through, and he would sit there. This man who had filled every room he'd ever walked into with his voice. And look out the window with an expression I had no name for. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was something more like bewilderment. Like a person who has been handed a puzzle with pieces missing and keeps turning it over, looking for the place where the missing parts must logically be. The bluster was gone, that reflexive filling of air with sound. The automatic social charisma that had, I understood now, served partly as a barrier. In its place was something quieter and more direct. He would look at me the way I had wanted him to look at me my entire childhood, and he would really look. The looking was clear, unobstructed, present. One afternoon, I was sitting with him while he worked on a word puzzle his speech therapist had given him. We'd been there about half an hour in comfortable silence, and he looked up and said, "Carolyn, you came." I said, Of course I came, Dad. He was quiet for a moment, working something through behind his eyes. Then he said slowly, effortfully, the words arriving like parcels he had to carry carefully so they didn't break. I didn't look at you enough. The room was very still. He said, I knew I wasn't. He stopped, tried again. I didn't know how to. That was all. That was everything. I didn't cry in the room. I was too busy staying very still. The way you stay still when something delicate has opened and you're afraid any movement will close it. But later, driving back on the country roads I'd driven in high school, I had to pull over. I sat in that car on a dark road under November trees and fell completely apart. All the way apart, in a way I hadn't let myself do in years. The kind of falling apart that feels less like breaking and more like something long held finally letting go. Because I understood what my father had just told me. Not just that he was sorry, but that he had known. He had lived for 32 years with the knowledge of his own failing. And I sat in the armchair across from her and watched her sleep and thought, circling around, approaching from different angles. And then she would say that again. She said, say that again. I said it again, slower, like I was feeling the words in my mouth. She said, what did it feel like right now to say that? I thought about it, truly thought about it. And I said, like jumping off something. She said, what did you land on? I sat with that for a long moment, and I said, something solid, like ground I didn't know was there. Dr. Marsh helped me understand over the following year was not what I expected. She did not simply help me process my parents, though that happened. She walked me through the history of people I had let partially close, and then methodically kept at a remove Priya, Marcus Daniel, Dr. Ellison Thomas. She walked me through the pattern from enough distance that I could see it as a pattern, not just a series of individual bad luck. Because you cannot give what you never had a model for. You cannot hand someone a language you have never spoken. That love is not something that lives between two people like a transaction. Love is something you build, something you practice. Marsh said something in our 11th session that I have thought about nearly every day since. And you teach it by loving fully, vulnerably, without guarantee of return, and discovering that you survive. I sat with that for a very long time. My brother Thomas called me in March. He needed more consistent support for our parents. It was a practical conversation, and when it ended, I sat at my kitchen table and felt the pull, the familiar calculation. If I don't get involved, I can't be disappointed. If I don't show up, no one can need me and fail me. I felt the pull, and then I felt something else underneath it. A want, genuine, unprotected, terrifying. I wanted to know my parents before I lost the chance. I wanted to try, actually try, with the armor off to be a family. And I wanted to stop being afraid of wanting things. I moved to Columbus that May, found a small apartment 20 minutes from my parents' house, took a remote editing job, domestic logistics of a household dealing with long-term illness. It was not glamorous. It was not emotional and cinematic. It was just turning up and doing the next small thing, which is what love actually looks like most of the time, if you watch carefully enough to see it. One Thursday morning, I picked up my father for his appointment, and once he was in the car, he looked out the window at his yard, his garden, really, which he'd kept with obsessive pride before the stroke, and which had gone somewhat to seed, and I saw something move across his face that I recognized immediately. Grief, plain and private. I said, "Do you want to work in the garden this weekend?" He turned and looked at me, and his face did something I had spent 32 years wanting to see from him. It just opened. Simple and unguarded. He said, "I'd like that." We spent 2 hours in the garden, and sometimes he'd get frustrated and go still. And I would just keep working next to him, pulling what needed pulling, turning what needed turning, and after a while the frustration would ease and we'd keep going. The morning was ordinary in every measurable way, but it was the most real morning I had ever spent with my father. Because for the first time, we were not performing anything. He taught me haltingly. I listened the way Priya had listened to me in 7th grade, leaned in, genuinely interested, wanting to know more. Then something I did not expect happened. He became interesting to me. My father, who had always seemed to me like a person I had been assigned rather than chosen, became someone I was actually glad to know. Here is what I started to understand. Slowly, across that spring and into summer, love is not a feeling that arrives complete. Love is a practice. A series of choices made repeatedly, in the face of history and fear and old beliefs. It is choosing to drive to the garden store and buy the specific soil amendment your father has been wanting. It is sitting with your mother while she tells the same story about your grandmother for the 4th time and listening as if you're hearing it fresh, because something in her needs to be heard saying it. It is calling your brother just to ask how he's doing. No agenda, just because he is your brother and you have spent too many years treating connection like a resource to be managed rather than a thing to be given. The most terrifying part of the practice, the part that took the longest, was letting people see that I was trying, letting them see the effort, because for so long I had believed that need was weakness, that showing you wanted something was the fastest way to have it taken. The armor had been designed precisely to hide the trying, and armor is heavy. I had been wearing mine for so long I had stopped noticing the weight. But that spring, as I drove back roads and sat in my parents' kitchen and called Thomas on Tuesday evenings for no particular reason, I started to feel the weight lifting, piece by piece, and in its place something lighter and scarier and more alive. In September of that year I met someone. Her name was Margot. She was a librarian at the Columbus Public Library, which I had started visiting on weekends because I missed the particular quality of library silence, that specific hush where people are present but absorbed, and no one expects anything from you except that you treat the books well. She was reshelving when I turned a corner and nearly walked directly into her cart. She had a startled, completely genuine laugh, not the polished social laugh people deplore, but the real one, surprised out of her, and she said, "I've been doing this for 8 years. You'd think I'd have learned to look at corners." Of Priya, that quality of genuine curiosity that is not performance but simply the way a person faces the world. I went back the following Saturday. Here is what was different this time. The circumstances weren't different. Margot wasn't different in kind from Daniel, or from the people I'd turned away before. What was different was me. Barely, incrementally, but actually. When she asked me about myself, I answered. Not the careful, managed version. I said things that were actually true. I told her I'd grown up in Ohio and left and come back because my father was sick. And she said, "That's hard." And instead of deflecting, I said, "Yes, it really is. Something they've never had language for before." And she looked at me in that way people sometimes look at you when you've said something that matches something in them. In November, we went to a reading together. In December, she came to one of the Sunday dinners at my parents' house, and my father found her name on the first try. "Margot," he said, clearly and without effort, and told her a long looping story about a camping trip that wandered and doubled back on itself, and she listened to all of it, every word, with her whole face. On the drive home that night, Margot reached across the console and took my hand, just held it, not saying anything, and I felt the thing I had been circling my whole life. That simple, uncomplicated, completely sufficient thing. We're here, I'm here, you're here. We don't have to explain it. I cried a little in the dark of the car. She didn't make a thing of it. She just held my hand. My father died 18 months after his stroke. The second one took him quickly, which the doctors said was a mercy, and I believe they were right. Though mercy and grief are not mutually exclusive, they occupy the same space, both of them true at once. I was there. Thomas was there. Margot drove me when I was too undone to drive myself, and in my father's last weeks, when language had mostly left him, he would hold my hand when I sat with him, and sometimes look at me and say something that was not quite a word but was completely clear. The way feeling sometimes moves through a face when language can no longer carry it. The last thing he ever said to me was my name. Just Caroline. Clear, without effort. Like he had always known exactly how to say it, and the stroke had only hidden that for a while. I carry that. It has been for years since my father's funeral. For years of the life I'm living now, which looks nothing like the one I'd built for myself by 34, and everything like the life I would have chosen if I had known how to choose. I'm still in Columbus. I have a proper home with space, a yard, a garden, a study full of books, and the manuscript I am finally writing. Every morning I see her there and I feel something I have no better word for than grateful. Not grateful to luck or fate, though maybe a little of that, but grateful to myself. For the choices I made when they were hardest. For staying in the garden. For not pulling back. For learning slowly, imperfectly, late but not too late. That love is something you choose to give, not something you wait to receive. My mother comes for Sunday dinner every other week. We are different with each other now. Not transformed, but real, more honest than we have ever been. That her own mother had never said them to her. That she had thought doing was enough, and she was sorry if it hadn't been. She said it without drama, without tears, just truth, delivered plainly. And I looked at her, this woman I had spent so much of my life experiencing as an absence, and I saw the shape of her own wound. The inheritance she had been carrying. The pattern handed from one generation to the next, not because anyone intends it, but because we can only give what we know. I said, "It's okay." And then I said, "I love you," which I had not said to her in years. And she said it back, just those 2 words. Thomas and his kids come once a month. The table is too full and someone always spills something, and the noise is the kind of noise I would have found unbearable at 30 and find. I know that might not land immediately. I know it might bounce off whatever you've built around yourself. You are someone who has not yet learned to give the thing you have been waiting to receive. Not perfectly, not after you've healed enough. Just now, with what you have, in the direction of whoever is in front of you. Begin small. Begin with a neighbor you've never spoken to. Begin with a phone call you've been avoiding. Begin with telling someone who matters to you that they matter to you, even if the sentence comes out sideways. Begin with staying in the room when every part of you wants to leave. Begin with asking yourself, what would I do here if I weren't afraid? Can then do that. It is a practice before it is a state. And in the doing, slowly, painfully, with many steps backward for every 2 forward, you discover the feeling. There's one last thing, the last piece. A few months ago, I was at the public library, returning a stack of books. I turned a corner in the biography section, maybe not, and the younger one was tucking the older woman's hair behind her ear. Just that, just 2 fingers and a small tender gesture. That specific, private hunger. That this dash is dash the dash thing dash I dash was dash never dash given. I stood there for a moment, and every old part of me said, mind your own business. And I said to the stranger, to the person wearing the look I had worn for 30 years, "Excuse me, can I help you find something?" She startled, put on her armor, said, "No, I'm fine." And I said quietly, "I know where the biographies are if that's what you're after." She looked at me for a moment. And then she said, "Yes, that would be helpful actually." We walked together to the section she needed. She found her book. We talked for a few minutes about it. She left with it under her arm. And I drove home with something full in my chest, that specific warmth of having turned toward someone instead of away. Of having chosen, in a small and ordinary moment, the giving rather than the holding back. That's what love is. That's all it is. And that's everything it is. It's turning toward someone instead of away. It's choosing, in 100 small moments, to show up rather than protect yourself. It's the garden on Saturday and the Sunday dinner and the phone call on Tuesday for no particular reason, and the hand held in the dark of a car and the 2 words said quietly in a kitchen. After too many years of silence. It took me 34 years in one grocery store, aisle and 1 stroke and 1 long road back and 1 therapist and 1 librarian and a garden in Ohio in the spring. It took every hard thing. But I got there, and so can you.